Introduced early in Splatoon 2's lifetime, Clam Blitz is easily the most difficult and most complex mode in Splatoon 3, which also makes it the least understood, but if you can master it, it can be the most rewarding. In this guide, I will cover everything from the basics, why the pity clam is good, why the power clams are not, how to push, how to defend, and even how to manipulate clam spawns in your favour. Hi, I'm Akira, barely notable competitive Splatoon player, and this is your ultimate guide to Clam Blitz. So at its core, the goal of Clam Blitz is to score as many points as you can by throwing clams into an enemy team's basket located somewhere on their side of the map. Clams are found all over the map. When you start the game, a bunch will spawn in semi-random locations around the map, and after that they will periodically spawn in set locations in groups of 3. Once you've collected a bunch of clams, you can't score them just yet. In order to score, you first need to open the basket by using a power clam. By collecting 8 clams, they will all fuse into a power clam. Throwing a power clam at the enemy team's basket will score that power clam as well as create a window where the basket is open and your team can freely score clams. This will also make your team's basket rise up, making it impossible for the enemy team to score while their basket is open. Once opened, the basket will stay open for 10 seconds and will close once that 10 seconds is over. Throwing in a normal clam will score 3 points and add 3 seconds to that timer, though the timer cannot go past 10 seconds. Throwing in a power clam will score 20 points and reset the timer back to 10. Scoring 100 will knock out the objective, ending the game immediately. If you don't knock out and the timer hits 0, the basket will close and rise up for 10 seconds, meaning you can't score until it comes back down. It will also incur a penalty onto the scoring team of 50% of the points they scored, rounding down, as well as give the enemy team a power clam, often called the pity clam, or just the pity. While the enemy team's basket rises into the air for 10 seconds after a push, your basket will drop immediately, meaning the enemy team has a 10-second window where they can threaten to score and you can't. This will be important later. Some final points is that any players who are killed whilst holding clams will drop up to a maximum of 3, or if they're holding a power clam, they'll just drop that instead. Any clams that were held by a player but are thrown or dropped on the ground will despawn after 10 seconds. This includes power clams. Clams that spawned naturally though do not have a timer and will stay there indefinitely. This includes the pity. And as you've likely figured out yourself in your solo queue games, power clams don't get thrown as far as normal clams. But that is the bare bones basics, and with that out of the way, we can finally move on to my favourite part, the theory. I want to focus a bit on the power clam for a sec here, because they have some unique properties that affect the way the mode is played. Sure, power clams are good because you need them to open the basket, but after that, power clams are terrible in every way. First off, point values. A power clam is worth 20 points, but is made from 8 clams, which is normally worth 24 points. So despite being 8 clams, it is worth about 6.6-ish. So when scoring, you always want to be throwing in individual clams rather than a power clam. Sure, this does take longer than scoring a single power, so there is a downside, but as we'll get to in the strategy section, you'll see that we can work around that very easily. A second point is that the person holding a power clam is always visible to the enemy team. This is an issue because, well, information is a valuable thing. Knowing where the power clam is allows the enemy team to really easily consolidate and coordinate around where the power clam is likely to push. It makes it very easy to focus your defenses and single out the most important player on the enemy team. It doesn't matter how good your push is if they're able to kill the power clam holder. Making multiple power clams only really makes it harder to push, since that's now 2 or even 3 players that the enemy team has perfect information on. I bring all of this up because this means that you really want to minimize the amount of power clams you make in order to push. In an ideal world, you only really want to be making 1 power clam to open the basket, and that's it. On top of that, you want to make the clam as late as possible to limit how much information you give to your opponents. In an ideal world, you'd make the power clam the moment you get under the basket, but don't worry about it too much, since it can sometimes be more practical to make it sooner. The pity clam is also important to mention because it's a power clam that has most of the benefits but none of the downsides. It is a power clam, so you can use it to open the basket whenever you want, and so long as you have it, there is a constant threat that you could push at any time from any angle, but so long as you leave it in your spawn and only pick it up when you need it. Additionally, the pity clam pretty heavily skews Clam Blitz towards getting one big push and disincentivizes repeated pushes. Just like in zones, Clam Blitz has a penalty. 50% of the points you score will be converted into penalty, and when you push again, you'll first need to get through that penalty before you can start adding to your score. As an example, if you score a power clam, you'll gain 20 points, and when the basket closes, you'll be left with a 10-point penalty. Score another clam, and it will score 20 again, but 10 of those points will go towards the penalty, and only the other 10 points will add to your score. In this scenario, you scored 2 powers, but only gained 30 points. Whereas if they were scored in the same push, you would would have gotten 40 points instead. Pity Clams make this worse, since it essentially gives the enemy team 20 points for free for every time you open the basket. Since the Pity Clam is an objectively better power clam, it is easier for the enemy team to counter push than it was for you to push. Since you never had a Pity Clam to use, you had to use a boring old power clam. And even then, if they don't use the Pity Clam to open the basket, they can still use it in their push to add an extra 20 points to their score, that again, you wouldn't have had access to. In Clam Blitz, counter pushes are major threats. And with this in mind, let's finally talk strategy. When looking at how teams push in Clam Blitz, the different pushes tend to fall into one of three categories that I've kind of just made up. I like to define them by how you get to basket and how you use your resources. While each one has their own ups and downs, there is a very clear hierarchy among them, and the one that I'm sure we're all familiar with, and the one right at the bottom of the hierarchy, is what I'm going to dub the super jump push. As I'm sure we're well aware from our time in ranked, the way a super jump push usually goes is that somebody sneaks their way under the enemy team's basket, spams this way, and then 2 or 3 people jump to them with power clams for an immediate 40 to 60 points. Sounds kinda nice, but not really. The main upside of this kind of push is that you get a lot of points, 40 to 60 in a very short amount of time. And once the power clam holders are in the air, there is practically nothing the enemy team can do to stop you from scoring, with the exception of tri-strike, tactical, and a well-timed bomb. And to be fair, those are some nice upsides to have. The issue with this push is that the downsides are much worse. The main downside of this kind of push is that once you score, you're dead. That's it. You're out of the game, and you very likely didn't trade out an enemy player. This gives the enemy team a massive opportunity to counter push, since you and your teammate or two won't be there to stop them. They will have a Pity Clam so they can break your basket the moment it drops, they'll have complete control of the middle of the map, which is where all the clams spawn, and they'll have a free passage straight to your basket, in exchange for some quick and easy points. This kind of push essentially sets up the enemy team to win the game, which isn't what you want. While you should try to avoid this kind of push when possible, don't completely count it out, since there is a scenario where it might be worth it. If the issue with the push is what comes afterwards, what if there was no afterwards? What if it was overtime and you need 40 to 60 points to win the game? Now the push might be worth it. But outside of that specific scenario, don't. So if the main problem of a super jump push is that it gets you killed, a good push is one that keeps you alive. If you want to succeed in Clam Blitz, we need to find a way to get to the enemy team's basket, score clams, and then get out without dying. And so, in order to do that, I present to you the quick push, the simplest and easiest way to go about this. So, what is a quick push? I'm going to define a quick push as when you spend some resources to get to the basket, score as many clams as you can in a short amount of time, and then get out before the enemy team mobilizes to stop you. You can probably see why I call it a quick push, because you don't really plan on staying there long. You run in, do what you need to do, get out. Generally, you start a quick push by using a bunch of resources, a bunch of bombs, a few specials, so that you can clear out the enemy team and hopefully pick up a few kills in the process, which should hopefully give you a safe passage to the basket. This is also why the push has to be quick, because you're on a time limit. You use a lot of resources to start the push, which means you won't have much left to fight back once the enemy team respawns and regroups. Try to fight back without specials and they'll probably kill you, which sets them up for a counter push, the thing we were trying to avoid by doing this. The upsides of a quick push are numerous. The biggest one is that you don't die immediately, so that the threat of a strong counter push is minimal. On top of that, this kind of push makes better use of singular clams. With a super jump push, you only had time to score 1 clam, and so it was best to use a power clam. With the quick push though, you can score many clams before you have to leave. You have time to throw in single clams, which are more efficient than power clams, and don't have to come in bundles of 8. But as good as the quick push is, there are downsides. The maximum amount of points your team can score is generally limited to the amount of clams they have on them at that time. If you don't have that many clams, you can't score that much. If you want a big lead or need a lot of points to get lead, one push isn't going to be enough. And if you have to do repeated pushes, you give the enemy team more opportunities and more pity clams for them to fight back with. And even if you have a lot of clams, you might not have enough time to score them before you have to retreat. Essentially, the quick push is good, very good in fact, but it won't always be good enough. But when trying to go for this kind of push, specials that can reliably get kills, as well as specials that can hold space under basket, are really strong. Specials like Zuka and Inkjet are good at picking up kills, and kills get you in. Specials like Missiles, Whale, and Booyah Bomb can create space for your team to move to basket, and Big Bubbler is useful to keep your team alive while scoring, and Tactical can be used to quickly move to and from basket, as well as minimize time spent respawning, should you stay in there a bit too long. So let's introduce the final category of push that I just made up, the best of the three, the theoretically perfect push, the long push. The goal of a long push is to try to maximise the amount of clams you can score in one push, and this is done by trying to keep the basket open for as long as possible. Instead of trying to throw your clams in at once, a team will generally dedicate one player to staggering their clams into basket, delaying their clam throws to keep the basket open for longer. This is done so that another player has time to back up to the middle of the map, pick up more clams, bring them to basket, and once they're back they can start staggering those in, so that another player can back up to mid, pick up more clams, get back to basket, start staggering those in, so that another player can go back, pick up, you get it, right? In theory, this can go on forever and score an infinite amount of points if you can get away with it. So you have this loop of players going back and forth, but the enemy team isn't going to let you get away with this, which is why you'll have two players committed to fending off the enemy team. Instead of using specials to get to the basket, they'll be using specials to keep the enemy team away from the basket, so that everyone else can score. Once you're out of resources to keep the enemy team away, you will eventually have to retreat back to the middle of the map so that you don't die and let the enemy team counter push. That's a lot to take in, but the upside of this push is that it maximizes the amount of points you can get in one push. It's even possible to go from 100 to 0 in a single push like this, and it's not that uncommon. And even if you don't knock out, it can get a big enough lead that you might not need to push ever again. It also minimizes the threat of counter push, since by pushing so few times, you're giving the enemy team less pity clams to work with. It is, in theory, the perfect push. The downside though is that it is difficult. Because you're trying to use your specials to keep the enemy team away from basket, you can't really use them to get to basket, else you'll have nothing to fight them with. This makes getting to the basket very slow and very difficult. You do it one step at a time, slowly encroaching on the basket until you get some lucky kills, and only then can you start scoring. That can be difficult to pull off at times, and sometimes there isn't enough time left in the game to do that. The second difficulty is in coordination. It can be difficult to know who has to do what, who scores, who backs up, who fights the enemy team, when do you swap roles, what roles do you swap to. This can be difficult to coordinate in a competitive team setting, and is practically impossible in solo queue unless you're in the tippity top rank. When trying to play for a long push, there are a lot of different qualities that the weapons in your team can have to make it a bit easier. Main weapons with high kill power like Stamper, Decalculator and Slosher are really useful for both starting the push by getting a few kills, as well as fighting the enemy team to keep them away from basket. Strong long range weapons with consistent pressure like Splatlings and Sniper Rifle are also really nice to keep the enemy team from the basket while you're trying to score. For specials, you're generally looking for ones with long durations, ones that can be used to control space to keep the push going. Specials like Inkstorm and Wavebreaker have an interesting niche here as a result. Big Bubbler is also really nice as you can use it ahead of the basket to put a barrier between your scoring teammates and the enemy team. No matter what kind of push you're going for, Tactical is really nice in this mode as the quick respawn means that the threat of counter push is minimized no matter how much you mess up. By the time the enemy team gets to your basket, you will have already respawned and ready to stop them from scoring. As a final note though, it's worth mentioning that these categories are made up. I made them up. The line between a quick push and a long push is completely arbitrary and made up. Just because you used a special to get to the basket doesn't mean you now have to quickly dump all of your clams. And just because you have a player spamming this way under the basket doesn't mean you have to jump to them. You don't have to jump to them. You shouldn't try to rigidly stick to what these categories tell you to do. Sure, they can be very useful rules in helping you make the best plays, but true mastery of the clam comes from knowing when to break the rules. Basically, don't take this too seriously. I'm just trying to give you a basic framework to help you learn, and that's it. Since we're looking for big pushes, how we handle the neutral is very important. Your goal in a neutral position is twofold. First, you're looking for ways to get control and expand control of the map. Secondly, and most importantly, you want to be collecting clams, because clams are what you use to win the game. Map control is a very vague term that we all kind of have this intuitive understanding of, but don't have solid definitions, which is awkward when you're trying to make a guide. So for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to say that a part of the map is under your control if you can easily use it, but the enemy team cannot. Usually done by inking that part of the map your colour. Still a bit of a vague definition, but whatever. You want strong map control because the more of a map you have access to, the more mobile you are. The better you can move to strong fights and take strong positions. The more you paint around, the more specials you can build, which can be good for starting a push or extending it, and the more of the map you control, the more clams you have access to. You want to spend a lot of the neutral also just picking up clams, because clams are how you do things in this mode. You need clams to throw into the basket, and the more clams you have, the higher score you can get. To even score in the first place, you need a power, which is made by collecting 8 clams, and even if you don't plan on scoring every single one of them, clams you're holding are clams your opponents are not. Even if you die holding 7 clams, you will only drop 3, which is 4 clams deleted from the game, 4 clams your opponents will never get. So generally, you want to spend neutral control on the map, picking up clams, and looking for opportunities to take advantageous fights to start a push. But let's say you lost neutral, and the enemy team is starting a push of their own. While there are a lot of different factors that can influence how you want to handle this, there is one rule that you must always follow. Don't panic. The more you panic and the more you rush, the more likely it is that you're going to make a mistake and make things even worse. As a general rule, when trying to stop the enemy team, you want to be doing so as a team. Playing together with all of your teammates alive is a surefire way to keep the enemy team away from the basket. To be even more effective, you can try playing for some of your specials, painting around while your teammates are respawning, for example, and then use that special to get some kills, control some space, maybe even set yourself up for a counter push. Something to keep in mind when trying to defend is how many points the enemy team has and how many clams they have. If you have lead already and the enemy team doesn't have enough clams to get the lead, you're in no rush and don't necessarily care if they're at your basket. This gives you time to, for example, get a strong flank or side angle to put yourself between the enemy team and the clam spawns in the middle of the map, so that if they want to score more and get lead, they need to get through you first. It can also be useful to pick up as many clams as you can while they're pushing, since again, any clams that you're holding are clams that they are not. But if the enemy team has a lot of clams and will easily get a very large lead, you will want to act sooner rather than later, since the quicker you stop the push, the less clams they will score, and the less clams you will need to score to get ahead later on. But as long as you don't panic and work together with your team, you should be fine. And that about does it. I genuinely believe that everything I've said up until now is all you need to succeed in Clam Blitz. If you wanted to, you could stop watching here and do really well in the vast majority of your ranked games and the vast majority of levels of competitive play. But for the advanced players out there is still a little section left just for you. But be warned, because the knowledge that I'm about to impart is very powerful, but if mishandled, can very easily backfire and make your clams games even more difficult. Because now, I'm going to talk about clam spawn manipulation. The simplest technique is the one that I'm sure most of us are familiar with: spawn blocking. As I mentioned before, clams will spawn in groups of 3 in predetermined locations specific to each map. However, clams can only spawn if that spawn point is not occupied. A spawn point is occupied if there is either at least one player or at least one clam in that location. This is very useful to us because if we combine this information with the previously mentioned fact that clams spawn to naturally do not despawn, we are able to deny clams from spawning in a location that we don't like. By picking up 2 of the 3 clams in that spawn and leaving only 1 in that location, we are able to guarantee that clams will not spawn in that location until the final clam is picked up. Picking up 2 of the 3 clams in a spawn point is often called spawn blocking, because it blocks the clams from spawning. You get it. This is pretty useful to us because we can essentially stop clams from spawning in awkward spots, and instead redirect them to spots we'd prefer. If you're trying to do a long push in the enemy team spawn, you want clams to spawn as close to the basket as possible so that you don't have to spend much time running back and forth from basket and mid. If you spawn block clams on your side of the map, you can guarantee that they will only spawn on the enemy team side of the map, which is where you are. This can backfire in a few ways though. Spawn blocking on your side of the map whilst you are not trying to push may just lead to clam spawning directly next to the enemy team. You gotta be careful with this one. Now, our second fact: not only are clam spawns on each map predetermined, they are also mirrored. If there is a clam spawn somewhere on your side of the map, in the name of fairness, there will also be a clam spawn on the corresponding point of the enemy team side of the map. In fact, this fairness goes so far as to ensure that if clams recently spawned in one location, the game will go out of their way to try and spawn clams at the corresponding point next time it tries to spawn clams. It will only try to do this once though, and if that corresponding point is occupied when it tries to, then it will just give up and go back to its normal spawning rules. But this is useful information to us, because if we leave certain clam spawns open, we can increase the likelihood that clams will spawn in certain locations. The main use case I can think is when you want clams to spawn in really awkward spots, like when the enemy team is trying to push. As an example, there's a clam spawn here on Inkbot, and when you're trying to push, this is a really awkward clam spawn. If the enemy team is trying to start a push, you could make a point of unblocking this clam spawn, since, well, first off, if they do spawn here, that's going to be pretty awkward for the enemy team. But also, if they do spawn here, and if the corresponding point is not occupied, which is likely if the enemy team did not go out of their way to spawn block it, the next clam spawn is forced to be at the corresponding point, which is even more awkward for the enemy team because of how long it would take to pick up those clams. Essentially, you can force the next 24 seconds of clam spawns to be useless. Now, as a final fact about clam spawns, the game will try to spawn clams once every 12 seconds. This number, however, will change depending on how many small clams are on the map. If there are less than 20 small clams on the ground or carried by players, power clams don't count. The rate at which the game attempts to spawn clams will increase to once every 4 seconds, tripling the speed at which clams spawn. This is also really useful information because you can manipulate the availability of clams by scoring them, hoarding them, making powers, or spawn blocking strategically. As an example, if you're trying to perform a long push, you want as many clams as you can get your hands on, and so you want to ensure that clam spawns are fast to maximize the amount of clams you can get. You can do this by picking up as many clams in mid as you can and scoring them quickly, and making sure that the difficult to reach clam spawns are blocked off with only one clam. Though again, be careful when trying to do this because if your team wipes, the enemy team will have accelerated clam spawns to counter push with. You can also slow down the clam spawns for your opponents who might be trying to get a push going. By trying to open a lot of clam spawns and holding on to as many clams as you can without making a power clam, you can keep the amount of clams in play very high, which will make the game spawn clams very slowly, making it difficult for the enemy team to get enough clams to push with. The final advanced tip has nothing to do with clam spawns and instead about passive special charge. Passive special charge is a mechanic in all ranked modes where teams that are generally considered to be at a disadvantage will gain a certain amount of points towards each player's special per second. Absent of any power clams being held by a player, the team that is losing will gain 3 points per second. If both teams are holding at least one power clam, the losing team will gain 3 points per second. However, there is one quirk to this system. If only one team has a player holding at least one power clam, the team holding the power clam will gain 3 points to their special per second, regardless of who's in the lead. While power clams are still very awkward to hold because they locate you on the map, you can use this mechanic to gain passive special charge even if you were in the lead by simply making a power clam. If the enemy team wants to gain that passive special charge for themselves, they will need to make a power, which makes it difficult to push. Essentially, if you're in the lead, it can be good to make a power clam since it forces the enemy team into a catch-22. Either make a power clam or let you have special advantage, neither of which is what they want. And that's it. Guide over. Thank God. Okay, that was hell to write. That was hell to record. And as I'm sure, it will be hell to edit together later. If you learnt anything from this hell that I put myself through, please like and subscribe. Please. Please. If you want to see more stuff like this, liking and subscribing is the best way to let me know, because if it does well, I'll do it again. And if you want to support me on Patreon, well, that is appreciated. I don't have it set up yet, so you can't. And what else is there to say? You know what, I haven't said this in a while. Hasta la vista.